But first, let's talk to a panel about this idea of a second referendum. Andrew, let's start with you. You raised this. It is, in some ways, quite extraordinary that the UK is now in the position of a second referendum. Will it gain significant enough traction, though, in the Commons that it actually starts being a possibility and starts becoming a reality?
Mm-hmm. I think what we're seeing now is such a level of parliamentary stalemate that basically, because Theresa May's deal, the probability of being passed has faded significantly, even more so after last week's summit of EU leaders. Every other conceivable possibility now increases in probability, and most people I'm talking to think that a second referendum is simply the only way to resolve it. Theresa May has ruled it out consistently. She's ruled it out firmly again today. She also ruled out calling an early referendum, and she also ruled out many other things that since came to pass. So it's hard to see, how it comes through without a significant number of Labour MPs coming in behind it and a significant number of Tory MPs. There's perhaps at least 70 already who would come out in favour of it. But day by day, I think the probability increases. But
isn't the problem here, and I spent a lot of time, Jennifer, in the UK in the last week or so, and there is a level of opinion that says we just need to get out. Far from having another vote, they view this as almost, as Theresa May has been seen today, a betrayal of democracy.
Well, I think one of the problems that hasn't seemed to have been addressed about a potential second referendum is what you put on the ballot paper. What options do you give to the people? Do you give it Theresa May's deal, no deal, or Remain? In which case, no matter which option comes out top, it's going to be a minority option because you're dividing the electorate by 3 instead of by 2. And I think that is something that the British populace doesn't really come to terms with. It's a first past the post system. There isn't proportional representation. So this whole question of how you even go about making that referendum work technically will be very complicated.
But also there's this idea that many British people feel that Tony Blair is essentially a traitor. It's a sense that you got from Downing Street over the weekend in reaction to that interview, saying that what is he doing? Undermining Theresa May's negotiations by telling other EU leaders, hold firm and you'll get a second referendum.
I mean, that's a very interesting angle. And Prime Minister Blair mentioned something really interesting, like coming up with a migration pact before any second referendum. I find that highly unlikely that the EU would engage in any sort of negotiation that would curb, for example, freedom of movement, as he said. So I think what's really interesting to see is how would the EU react to any sort of second referendum. The EU has said this is the deal on the table and it's not likely to change.
It also necessitates, if there is to be a second referendum, there will have to be an extension of the Article 50 deadline, which means that we're going to be talking about this for months, if not years.
But are the British people going to buy an EU army, which Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel have talked about recently? Are they going to buy, essentially, potentially, a deeper Eurozone? And is the EU going to allow greater reform or movement on the free movement of people?
I think who buys what very much depends on who's selling it. And I think, actually, Tony Blair is probably the wrong person to be trying to sell a second people's vote.
He said that he thinks European leaders would be willing to give a special arrangement or at least reform freedom of movement rules if the EU is to come back in. I think there actually is a willingness among EU leaders to look at that question, but not as some kind of carrot or incentive to get the UK back in.
You're right, the deadline is so tight. It's not going to happen in the next couple of months. It takes Europe years to decide anything.
And they also have sort of a bad experience with negotiating with the UK, with David Cameron, to appease some of the concerns of the UK public or UK politicians, because before the first referendum, there was an agreement between the EU and the UK to reform the EU, but that wasn't featured in the referendum campaign at all. So I think there is a reluctance to do that again and come to the same result.
It's a bit like democracy. If the second referendum, it's the worst idea apart from all the other ideas that are out there.
But isn't also the truth of the matter that when you listen to the pollsters over the weekend, pollsters get things wrong from time to time, but when you listen to them, they reiterate, Jennifer, that there has not been any great shift in public opinion in the last 2 years. And thus, if there was a referendum, the assumption that somehow Remain would win is not necessarily true.
Well, I think to say pollsters sometimes get things wrong is a dramatic understatement if you look, particularly in the UK over the last few elections. But, there has been something of a shift. It was a very tight margin one way or the other. You've got people whose votes didn't count for various reasons. We've got all the young people who have come of suffrage since the actual, in the last 2 years. So, those small things could make a big difference. Well, it's always going to be tight, though.
It is interesting they're talking about giving votes to 16 and 17-year-olds and potentially to EU nationals as well. Of course, we're denied the vote in 2016. But this is not new, is it really? Revisiting the outcome of a big vote with a second referendum has happened before here in Europe, particularly, of course, in the European Union. Denmark and Ireland have both held second referendums on EU treaties within 18 months of the first vote. Denmark held their second referendum to approve the Maastricht Treaty in 1993 after it had been rejected the year before. And Ireland's second referendums were held for Nice in 2002 and the Lisbon Treaty in 2008. In all cases, the EU got its way and the no results from the first vote were reversed. Isn't that the extraordinary thing, is that we have been here before multiple times?
Yeah. I think it's fair to note, though, that countries that have referendums to decide issues generally, as a rule, will come back to issues without substantiating. I mean, you mentioned Ireland. I'm Irish myself. And I think on the issue of abortion, which was resolved this year and it was legalised, it was the sixth referendum over several decades on the same question. So I don't think, I mean, it's hard to sustain the argument that having a referendum on another topic is in itself always undemocratic. But the question is, has something changed or have people learned something since the last time?
But isn't that the problem, Esther, that actually the UK is not like other EU nations? It is not used to. This was only the third, I think, UK-wide referendum ever. So it's not used to having referendums. And so this referendum is held in higher esteem than for other countries like Denmark or Ireland, for example.
That could cause trouble within the UK, or political trouble, but I think from an EU perspective, the UK is just like any other members in the still 28-member bloc. So from that perspective, I think the EU sees it as a UK internal political debate. They've agreed to the withdrawal agreement, and now they're waiting how the UK will sort this out.
And Jennifer, do you think this does any damage to, if there was a second vote, for example, do you think it damages the EU to a degree that, yet again, it seems that essentially Brussels just gets its way?
Well, we'll keep asking you until you give us the right answer, sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, but then again, as you mentioned, those other cases, you know, and I think one of the best indicators of future behaviour is past behaviour. So it's very likely that if there is a second vote, it'll happen because, you know, EU forces and those in the UK will believe that it's going to be a different outcome, as Andrew says. There's no point having it if nothing has changed or if people haven't learned anything. But we now know an awful lot about the misinformation, disinformation campaign that was going on. And so that may have changed people's minds.
Just very finally, so referendum, yes or no? Do you reckon it's going to happen?
No.
No?
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
Maybe.
You're going to have to be a yes then.
50-50.
There we go. Insights like that.